What's up, y'all? You know what time it is. It's about to be that time.
What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the second episode of the Layup Line, and today we're going to be talking about the Eastern Conference NBA franchises that decided to part ways with their head coach this past season. Now, we're going to be starting in chronological order. So, the Cleveland Cavaliers started their season with John Beilein as their head coach. John Beilein led them to a 14-40 record until JB Bickerstaff took over, and you have them to a 5-6 record in his 11 games as coach. They had an offensive rating for the season that was 25th ranked and a defensive rating that was 29th ranked. No one wins in the NBA without talent, and the Cavs weren't exactly stacked in that department. They had some unhappy veterans in the locker room, as well as a first-round pick who underwhelmed in his rookie year. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about John Beilein because his time with the Cavs was short-lived. He was a veteran coach in the college ranks, and he was expected to develop the Cavs' young talent in Sexton and Garland. That never really worked without the veteran buy-in needed to last in the locker room, and he was shortly replaced. Now, JB Bickerstaff got to coach a better version of this Cavs team, with Andre Drummond being added at the trade deadline, but I do think JB Bickerstaff being added as head coach improved the team. They were notably better at passing with a higher assist with a minimal impact on their turnovers. They had impactful wins against Miami, Denver, San Antonio, and Philly, and had a better field goal percentage, but they were similarly bad on defense. I think JB Bickerstaff was a good hire, and I'm not necessarily as low on the Cavs as a lot of others might be this season. I'm not quite at predicting a playoff appearance for the Cleveland Cavaliers next season, but I do think with some internal improvement from young players like Darius Garland, Colin Sexton, Kevin Porter Jr., they could be a threat to fight for that 8th spot.
They double team and get a good shot out of that, but that's not what we did, and I was frustrated.
Everybody's watching you out there, and that as frustrated as the coach gets, as frustrated as we can't display that on the floor. But I think it's been, all year long. It has really been. It's difficult for some of our guys who don't want to lose, and they want to play and they want to play better, and we just got to keep working on it.
Now, the next team to fire their head coach were the New York Knicks. They started the season under head coach David Fizdale, who led them to an unimpressive 4-18 record. He was then replaced by former G League head coach Mike Miller, who led them to a 17-27 record. They had an offensive rating for the season that was 29th ranked and a defensive rating that was 18th ranked. The Knicks are a reminder that no NBA coach wins without talent. David Fizdale had built himself a nice reputation as an assistant coach for the Miami Heat championship teams and as the head coach at the end of the grit and grind Grizzlies era. He's by no means a bad coach, but his time in New York certainly was. The team didn't make it easy for him with an ill-fitting roster of way too many power forwards and way too many guards and definitely not enough shooting. But his rotations didn't always optimize things for the team to get wins, and that showed up in his record. The team was far improved under Mike Miller, but again, there's not really too much of a reason to talk about his time as head coach because ultimately they decided to move on from him and hire Tom Thibodeau. It's really tough to make predictions about the Knicks' future going forward under head coach Tom Thibodeau because it really just depends on what decisions they decide to make with the roster. I don't expect him to make any significant jump in wins if they decide to bring back this same roster. There's no offensive system that Tom Thibodeau could bring to the Knicks that will have a bad lineup consistently score against decent to average defensive teams in the NBA. It's just not realistic. The team will have to make improvements to the roster, add in more three-point spacing, and make decisions like getting a point guard. The Knicks have a considerable amount of cap space, and they do have a top 10 pick coming into this year's draft, and I expect eyes to be on the front office a lot more than on the coach for right now. Once improvements are made to that roster, then it's going to be on Tom Thibodeau if he can make the best out of it.
We just felt like, given that this is our 10th game, we felt we had an obligation to come and speak to you guys. Obviously, Scott and I are not happy.
Next up is the Brooklyn Nets, who had one of the most surprising announcements when they decided to part ways with their head coach Kenny Atkinson, who had led them to a 28-34 record. Now, this is the season that they knew Kevin Durant was not going to play in. This is a season where they suffered injuries to Kyrie Irving. You could argue that Kenny Atkinson was just making the best of a bad situation to that point. And you could argue that given his track record with the team before that season, guiding their young talent to being in a position that they could sign Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, that he should be given a fair shot to coach the team when they were at full health. But it was obvious from the reporting that Kenny Atkinson was not necessarily the most popular head coaching choice for the Brooklyn. Some would say it's because Kyrie and Kevin Durant didn't like Kenny Atkinson, partly because he decided to start young center Jarrett Allen over their veteran friend DeAndre Jordan, who joined them on the Nets. In fact, Kyrie and KD took a pay cut to join the Nets so that they could fit DeAndre along with them. So it was a little awkward that he was not getting starting minutes. This season was a tryout for everyone on the Nets organization if they were going to be a part of their long-term future, and it just seems that Kenny Atkinson didn't quite make the cut. Kyrie Irving has already been publicly quoted that the team needs to make some moves in order to be in championship contention. They have eyes on other notable stars around the league, and a few of their guys might be in trade rumors during the season. Interim head coach Jacques Vaughn performed well enough during his opportunity to coach the team to be brought back as a lead assistant this year. Ultimately, they decided to bring in first-time head coach Steve Nash. Now, this was about as surprising as the Kenny Atkinson fire, if not more, but they've already surrounded him with a veteran group of assistant head coaches to help him out. They've also brought in a big name like Amari Stoudemire to assist in player development for a few of their young guys as well. The Nets have a lot of stars this season, and it's really going to be interesting to see how they mesh, who gets traded off the team. There's a lot of interesting dynamics and storylines to pay attention to this Brooklyn Nets locker room. As interesting as all the transaction stuff is, I think the basketball for the Nets will be actually a lot more interesting. Steve Nash has already come out and said that Kevin Durant will be playing at the 5 for them as well for certain stretches, which I think really calls into question who their best defender is on this team. Because if Kevin Durant is at the 5, I'm just curious how they intend to play him. I imagine he'd be in a drop style coverage protecting the rim, but I think that's kind of weird. Like, who's their best defender on the perimeter at that point? And I think without a high defensive ceiling, this team isn't necessarily going to be able to get that championship window, which is just going to fuel the transaction talk more. But that's kind of the dynamic the Nets are going to be dealing with for the season.
We need, one more piece or two more pieces that will complement myself, KD, DJ, GT, Spence, Karras, and, we'll see how that evolves.
With that being said, Kyrie, what do you want to try to get out of the next few months?
To just be healthy, man.
The next team in the East that I want to talk about is the Chicago Bulls. They went into the season under head coach Jim Boylen, who led them to a 22-43 record with a 27th ranked offense and a 12th ranked defense. Now, the Bulls underperformed the talent on the roster. Granted, veteran wing Otto Porter did spend a portion of the season injured, but still managed to appear in 14 games. They signed veterans like Tomas Satoransky and Thaddeus Young during the offseason to boost the depth of the team, but still weren't able to really fuel this team's offense this year. Jim Boylen got a lot of criticism for the Bulls underperforming this year for things like his decision to not play Kobe White with the starting lineup all up until the last game before the season was interrupted. Young players like Lauri Markkanen and Wendell Carter seemingly regressed after promising years prior. Boylen also struggled managing timeouts late in games, was criticized for overusing his bench down the stretch of close games, and for generally just underperforming against good teams. Now, to make the playoffs, you gotta win against good teams once in a while, and the Bulls just really couldn't manage to do that. They did have a win against the Clippers, but that came without Kawhi or Lou Williams. They did have a win against the Mavericks, but that came with pretty much just Luka Doncic and the bench playing for the Mavericks. Mavericks that game. There's just not a lot of positive you can say about Boylen's time with the Bulls, and he was widely considered probably the worst coach in the league for the season. When you also account for the fact that there were constantly rumors that the guys in the locker room didn't necessarily support Boylen either, it really can be seen that the Bulls had the biggest upgrade in coach this season. During the course of this pandemic, the Bulls decided to replace Jim Boylen with new head coach Billy Donovan, who was formerly head coach in Oklahoma. Now, Billy Donovan was coaching Oklahoma for several years, but he's primarily getting this job based off his performance last season when the Thunder were able to make it to the 5th spot in the Western Conference, despite having traded their two best players in Paul George and Russell Westbrook. I think personally that this has led to a bit of an overrating of Billy Donovan, because I think if he was fired the season before, after they had a disappointing playoff exit to the Portland Trail Blazers with Damian Lillard waving the team goodbye, he probably would not have been receiving another head coaching job in the league this quick. Billy Donovan also blew a 3-1 lead during his time with the Thunder, and they just continued to have some disappointing playoff exits post Kevin Durant's departure in 2016. As pessimistic as I may be about Billy Donovan, I do think he's a huge upgrade from someone like Jim Boylen, and I do expect him to get the most out of the Bulls this coming season.
Here from Jim Boylen, what are you doing? I've known Jim a lot. Like, what? Seriously, like, what strategy are you talking? It's a 25-point blowout. There's a minute 4 left. It's Super Bowl Sunday. I want to get out of here.
The next team in the Eastern Conference to pay attention to is the Philadelphia 76ers, who went into the season under head coach Brett Brown, who led them to a 13th ranked offense and an 8th ranked defense. Now, the numbers to really pay attention to for the Sixers are their 31 wins at home out of 35 games. They also were 12-26 on the road. They had some embarrassing losses to non-playoff teams on the road and some of the most dominant wins of the season against title contenders like the Bucks and Lakers. So I'm inclined to believe that despite the poor fit of the roster at times, there was a good team in here somewhere. They have the pieces to what looks like a flexible and effective playoff defense, but they were ultimately unable to space the floor enough to make the most of their offense, so it just didn't matter for them. Brett Brown wasn't a bad coach, but it just started to show that he wasn't the right guy for Philadelphia. He wasn't playing in a way that maximized their offense, often keeping too many non-shooters on the floor, and it also seemed he was losing the locker room, with Ben Simmons all but refusing to take threes despite being asked by Brett Brown in the media to get in 1 3 a game. When you also look at the reporting that Brett Brown not being hard enough of a coach is what got Jimmy Butler out of there last year, it just really didn't make sense to keep him around. And the Sixers have decided to replace Brett Brown with new head coach Doc Rivers, which was a controversial selection after Doc Rivers is coming off a season in which he blew his 3rd 3-1 lead in the playoffs. This was a huge decision for the Philadelphia 76ers to make, because Doc Rivers is probably going to be the last coach that Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid ever have playing together if they ultimately decide to break that duo up. So his ability to get the most out of those two on the court together is going to be huge for their long-term future. Brett Brown wasn't always able to coach a healthy 76ers team, and he didn't always benefit from a front office that optimized the roster. Doc Rivers is going to have to be able to navigate all of that now. Doc Rivers has been left with a team that doesn't necessarily fit together, and the front office has some moves to make in order to provide some shooting for that team. But the Sixers looked at the coaching market and ultimately decided that they probably weren't going to be able to do any better than a former champion head coach who was still very much respected in league circles.
Somebody asked, can you control him? Like, can you control Jimmy? If you can control Jimmy, we would think about having him back. Mm-hmm. I was like, you don't got to worry about it. Shit, can't nobody control me.
Last Eastern Conference team to talk about is the Indiana Pacers, who went into the season under head coach Nate McMillan, who led them to a 45-28 record with a 19th ranked offense and a 6th ranked defense. Now, the only reason that you can say Nate McMillan is no longer the head coach of the Indiana Pacers is because they got swept in the first round. That's it. He was given a year extension pretty much a week before the playoffs started, and after they were swept, the team decided to part ways with him. Nate McMillan is another one of those guys who never necessarily got to coach the team while they were full healthy, with injuries to key players like Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. But at the end of the day, the NBA, there has to be no excuses, and it's all about winning. Sometimes you're just the guy that gets the raw end of that deal. Now, I like Nate McMillan as a head coach, and I do hope to see he gets picked up somewhere else, because he was always able to keep the Pacers in the top half of the league on defense each season there. But it was his unimaginative offense full of mid-range jumpers that was going to put a ceiling on his long-term future with the Pacers. Indiana is replacing McMillan with new head coach Nate Bjorkgren, who was formerly an assistant under Nick Nurse with the championship Toronto Raptors. It's not uncommon to see a team choose a head coach that was a prominent assistant on a championship coaching staff. It's not clear what kind of coach Nate Bjorkgren will be yet, but if he's anything like Nick Nurse was, we can expect a level of offensive and defensive versatility from the Pacers that we haven't seen in some time. However, there are some rumored roster shakeups that could still happen with the team, so who really knows about their long-term future quite yet. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate everyone who made it through. I know today's video was a bit of a longer one. I don't expect them all to be quite this long, but there were a number of coaches to run through, and I did want to do at least a basic get to know you on each one of the new coaching spots in the Eastern Conference. I'm working on a Western Conference video, and I'm not sure when I expect that one to drop, but there's still some pending moves to be made in that conference as well, so we'll see. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Thank you and have a wonderful day.